Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Gio and Joey show. Last week we took off because I was at a 10-day camp meeting. It was a good thing, busy work, great relationships, getting to meet people. Joey, how's your summer been so far?
Trying to stay busy, but not busy enough.
Yeah, I could understand that. I was busy for 10 days, but summers tend to be kind of slow as well. Today's episode is the separation of church and state, a myth. Why did you decide to talk about that today?
Well, mainly because something happened in the news that I think there's some good, but I think there was some dangerous things said and promoted from not someone in government, but someone who was doing a report for the government. And so
Mm.
I just think it's important that we kind of, as citizens, that we push back
And
and
stay
stand for true
informed.
principles.
Let me read something that I have here. It says this: on May 1st, 2025, President Trump signs an executive order creating the Presidential Religious Liberty Commission, chaired by Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, vice chaired by Ben Carson. We'll talk about him in a bit. Members are almost entirely conservative Christians. One Jewish rabbi, also Phil McGraw, Eric Metaxas, Cardinal Dolan, Rabbi Soloveitchik, Paula White Kane. Over a year, this commission has gone on, 7 hearings, 103 witnesses of various faith, many describing religious persecution they say they experience here in the land of the free, the home of the brave, at work, in school, and in the military. And so the reason this is coming up now is that on June 26th, though, of this year, 2026, the commission delivers its 224-page draft report, Americans' First Freedom, to the president in the Oval Office. Public comment window ran through July 13th, and the final report is now being prepared, and people have issues with it. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say, first of all, I'm glad that the president had started a religious liberty commission. I I watched, not all of it. Each session was like 5 hours, right? But
Yeah,
I watched a considerable amount of it,
amount.
and there was a lot of good stuff in this commission. One thing that I will praise, the commission for is, so obviously you listed, there were Jews, right? It was obviously majority
Mm-hmm.
conservative Christians, but there was Catholics and Protestants. There were Jewish rabbis. There was a Muslim lady, I forget what her name was, who was part of it, right? But the thing about the witnesses that were called and the discrimination that they reported on and that they talked about throughout their commission included discrimination against Muslim Americans, Jewish Americans, Christian Americans, Hindus, Buddhists, right, and other minority faith, Native American spirituality and stuff. And that is a good element of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, even of the report, they were very, very good about making sure that the government protects every American's um, the free exercise part of the First Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
Really good on that. Where I have concerns, where obviously many people in our denomination have concerns, but not just ours. People who are concerned about religious liberty and the First Amendment in general had some concerns. Is some of the comments first by the chair Dan Patrick, and then in some of the language of that initially came out in the report, right, and the way it described the separation of church and state.
Yeah,
And so that's where I would say,
let me jump in with that, right? Dan Patrick summarized it himself. After all those witnesses and months of testimony, the one constant theme he talked about was that the phrase separation of church and state has been weaponized against religious people. That framing is exactly why we want to talk about it, because when we mention the phrase separation of church and state, that may mean something different to you, and I'm not saying you, Joey, you, the audience, than it means to us Adventists, because we have a history of protecting religious freedom and liberty of conscience for all people. And so there were some things in summaries I were reading that we have to clarify, right, in order to make sure we have protections for all people.
No, that's really good. And in that where you quoted, Dan Patrick there, he's correct that the phrase has been weaponized by
Mm-hmm.
people, by extreme secularists who have a view of that phrase that basically means get rid of free exercise,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like there have been abuses by the secular left and just by the left in general and by government and in universities and whatnot that have tried to push religious people and their expression out of the public square. So he's correct that a misapplication of the separation of church and state has been used to suppress religious people, and I'm against that.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a phrase, right? Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And there's a much bigger danger, and especially when people know history, of not having any separation. But the actual idea of a separation of church and state, this wasn't some secularist plot. This
No.
was sincere, honest, and it wasn't Seventh-day Adventists. There were no Seventh-day Adventists
Yeah.
around. We defend it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this was our other Protestant brothers and sisters, right? Particularly, well, in the American context, right? Rich,
Roger.
Roger Williams, yeah, over
Mm-hmm.
in Rhode Island, right? And why? Was he some sort of secularist? No, he was a devout Christian preacher. He was actually, I think, he was originally a Puritan or Puritanish, but then he started having some issues, and he became more Baptist because he recognized that when we all these people who had come over to the Massachusetts Bay Colony for religious freedom themselves, when they got here, they weren't exactly very tolerant of their other
Other
Christian
religions.
brothers and
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
sisters who, and at the time it was just, in this colony it was just Christians, and they weren't even tolerant of those small differences. And yet he goes to Rhode Island and he founds a colony where Native Americans and and Baptists like himself and Catholics and Quakers and Jews, right, they could all live in harmony. And that was obviously, in the 1600s, right? But that model would wind up influencing the American founders, and that's how we got the Establishment Clause.
Yeah, before we, because I want to expand on that and talk about that a little bit more. But before we do that, there's an assumption that secularism is itself not a religion. It may not use the language that it's a religion, but it has its morals, it has its understanding, it has its borders, it has its orthodoxy per se, right? And so that, in a sense, lately has been getting favored while pushing overt religion, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, all these, as if they were secondary or lesser than. And so, what Joey and I argue for is that every thought should have the ability to share in the public square, but the government should not favor any one of those. It should be free. It should be the power of persuasion, and is how thought should live, whether it's a secular thought, an atheistic thought, a Christian thought, a method, a Muslim, Islam, Judaism, Hindu, whatever. It should be the power of persuasion. Once the government start using the sword, and that's what you were alluding to with Roger Williams, early on, they were fleeing that kind of tyranny from Europe, and yet how quickly the human heart falls back to what it's comfortable with or what it knows, may not necessarily be comfortable with it, but what it knows. And they had to stop that here in order for this nation to thrive.
And just so people have an understanding of just what they were fleeing, right, in Europe, I've been reading this book here for my devotions lately,
Oh,
Fox's Book of
mercy.
Martyrs.
I'm familiar with it.
This cover's a little torn up because my dog got a hold of it. Luckily, the book itself was fine, but this was from what I read this morning for my worship. It's on the persecutions in Scotland. I'll just read a little bit here.
Mm-hmm.
It's about this guy Patrick Hamilton. Now Patrick Hamilton, he had just some background. He had gone to Germany, right, and been influenced by Luther, and then Melanchthon, who was Luther's friend, right, and their kind of emerging reformed beliefs. And so it says, now inflamed with true knowledge of faith and godliness, Patrick Hamilton was anxious to return to Scotland and teach his countrymen the right ways of God and Christ as shown clearly in the scriptures. Taking with him his three companions, he returned home without delay and began to teach wherever he could. Soon, however, James Beaton, the Archbishop of St. Andrews, who was an adamant papist, heard of Hamilton's teachings and summoned him to appear before him, which Hamilton did without delay, thinking he would have an opportunity to dispute papist doctrine. But after only a short examination, the archbishop had him arrested and held in the most loathsome part of St. Andrew's Castle until the next morning, when he was taken before a council of bishops for further examination as a heretic. And then what happens? When they brought Hamilton to the stake, he knelt down and prayed fervently for some time. When he finished, he was trained to the stake, and faggots, that's just an
Yeah,
English word
yeah.
for sticks,
Yeah, I
and
know.
faggots were piled around him. A bag of gunpowder was then placed in each armpit and set on fire first, but they did not explode. And I don't need to read all the gory
Yeah.
details. This book, I will warn people, I do recommend people read this book. It's quite unsettling.
Yeah, but
But
it's definitely not a children's story hour reading.
no, um, but it's a reminder. But again, these were faithful Christian people. These weren't, secularists. In other words, so that is why these early Protestants and stuff that came to America, they had this in their memory, and that's why the separation of church and state came. And so, yes, maybe it can be abused, but we cannot forget that history. And then I would even say, right, because obviously what I was talking about here was persecution from papists towards Protestants. But listen, in the old world, it happened the other way too.
Yeah.
And listen, in
Calvin
America's
had people
history,
killed.
yeah, Calvin had people killed, but also in America's history, right? Because Catholics were sometimes seen as outsiders and immigrants, right? When they came, they were also abused, right? Their religious liberty
Hmm.
rights were not always recognized. And so I think that there is a universal message that we can all, as Americans, embrace that, listen, I may disagree with my Catholic brothers and sisters, or my Baptist brothers and sisters, or my Muslim neighbors, or my Jewish neighbors, but when it comes to the distinctives of our religion, like, we are going to defend all of our fellow citizens' right to worship as we understand worship to be.
Going back to the report claimed that the wall of separation never appears in the Constitution. And that's true. But something can be factually true and you can miss the whole boat and miss the whole meaning of what the founders were trying to address. And so just because the phrase itself doesn't appear in the Constitution doesn't mean that it's not part of our founding fathers. And I'm reading something here. It says it's a metaphor from Jefferson's 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptists that the Supreme Court elevated and that has since been misapplied to push religion out of public life. And the report goes on to call, and that was our thumbnail, that the report calls the wall a myth created by 20th century jurisprudence. And so that's what we have to argue. Why should there be a wall? They want to call it more like a bridge, but a bridge has a function of working two ways. And if a bridge works two ways, that is encouraging the government to entangle itself in religion and religion to entangle itself in the government. And the old world, as you were reading in the Fox Book of Martyrs, that's never a winning combination.
Yeah, and I would just say to I find it a little funny that a fellow Christian would get confused on the fact that, oh well, the phrase isn't there, right? But
Mm-hmm.
because here's the thing: the concept is clearly in the
Yeah.
Constitution, right? It's the
Hmm.
Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. That's the
Yeah.
concept. And then
And mind you, it's
Jefferson,
the
who was
First Amendment. Like they
yeah,
thought of that right away.
and Jefferson was there, right? Like Jefferson was one of these founding fathers, right? And
His signature's on the document.
when he was describing to the Danbury Baptists our constitutional system, that's how he described it, right? So he said, "Hey,
Hmm.
this establishment clause sets up a wall of separation, right?" But for Christians, it's a little humorous that they can't understand that he's at least pretending. I'll say he's honest, right? Like doesn't
Hmm.
understand that you can have a concept without having the term. Right? It's like we believe in a Trinity, but
Yes.
the Trinity is never in the Bible, and yet
Hmm.
we understand that if you read the whole Bible, right, and you study it, right, the concept of the Trinity is taught, but the
Yeah.
word is not. And so I'd love to have a conversation with Dan Patrick, but
Speaking of which, he further went on to say beyond the report, right? The report calls it a myth, but he publicly went beyond the report and called it a lie. Right. So the question then, right, in the comment, if we had him here and had a conversation with him, you know, like you were just saying, what of the principle do you not understand? Yeah, the phrase may not be there, just like I was going to use the same example, the Trinity, right? That may not be in the Bible verbatim. The verbatim separation of church and state may not be there verbatim, but how could you miss the principle? It's explicit, especially if a person in his position would have to read the Federalist Papers, right? Come on, it's the human heart, the corruption of the human spirit that they were kind of forming the government against, right? Three tiers, the balance, checks and balance, all of that. How could you miss it? Unless, and this is where I don't know if you want to go there, we'll go there later, what Revelation 13 and 14 say about where we're headed. Go ahead.
yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, we know at some point that is going to happen, and so
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the things. Like I said, I want to give people the benefit of the doubt. But
Mm-hmm.
at a certain point, you just got to say, like, you're wrong, right? Like, maybe you can have the right intentions.
Yeah.
Maybe, like you said, you're not wrong about everything. But
What's the
on this
phrase, right?
point,
The road to hell is paved with good
good
intentions.
intentions. Yeah. And so, like I said, I would I would push back strongly on this point. Right, one thing that I appreciate that there was a lot of movement of various Adventists urging others to, before the public comments closed,
Hmm.
to put in our comments. Right, there was there.
Hmm.
I did that, and then I also well, I haven't said it yet. Well, I did my public comments, but I'm currently writing a letter to my congressman and my state rep, and just letting him know, hey, I think these are kind of concerns, and I'm trying to definitely bring it from a conservative viewpoint, right? Because a lot of, and I feel like sometimes this can almost hurt the religious liberty argument when the conservative voices who believe in religious liberty sometimes aren't loud enough. And
Hmm.
so the only people who are, say, attacking this are like people who are on the left, who
Fringe.
maybe
Yeah.
more are militant secularists or have some other kind
Hmm.
of crazy views. And so then it's easy for people like Dan Patrick to say, well, they're only attacking me because, they're radical
They're
Marxists
crazy.
or
Yeah.
whatever. But nobody can call me a Marxist. Nobody can call me a leftist. Right? My
Hmm.
my conservative bona fides are well documented. So that's why I'm writing, my lawmaker and stuff, and being like, hey, like, I think this is a core American value that is being undermined here.
So, I have some notes here, right? So there were seven key, well, I don't want to say seven, but here are seven things the document proposes. One, have the Department of Justice issue official guidance on the proper understanding of the Establishment Clause and church state separation. The executive branch defining the First Amendment's meaning. I think Congress and the courts should define it, not the executive branch. Because if you have, let's say, a conservative president, he's going to define it one way. If you have a liberal president, he's going to define it a different way. But that's one of the things they mentioned. 2, a religious liberty violation hotline and a DOJ religious liberty task force. How do you feel about that one? Because I could see how that I could see the well intention behind it, but then it almost seems like you're going to start policing,
But
religion.
here's my issue with that.
Mm-hmm.
We already and this, my friend Jeff, if my friend Jeff Mayhew were here, right, we could go on a whole
Yeah.
thing about who the actual most important branch is. It's Congress, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have a representative in government, right? All of us do, right? If you're a
Yeah.
citizen of the U.S., you live in right, you have a congressional representative. Write them. If they don't respond, call their office. Write them again. Like
Mm-hmm.
again, be respectful about it.
Yeah.
But you have someone in the government who their job is to represent your interest and your community's interests. So my issue here with this DOJ hotline thing is it's getting citizens to think that their representative, right, is the executive branch. No, 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 no.
Mm-hmm.
The executive branch is about enforcing the laws that the legislative branch puts out. But yeah, if your religious liberty is threatened, I do think you should let the government know, but you should do it by letting your congressman know or congresswoman or whatever. And then also on the state level, your state rep. So I would say that's the means for letting him know that there's an issue, not calling up the DOJ specifically.
And here's where you and I think, can spend a good time talking about. The third thing they kind of like are bringing up is a repeal of the Johnson Amendment, letting churches endorse candidates. And I don't know how you feel about that, but as Adventists, we're never going to be endorsing candidates. And if you start going down that path, letting every church do that, then church becomes less church and it just becomes a religious political outpost, regardless of denomination. And so that's one thing they're looking to do, repeal the Johnson Amendment, which prohibits churches from endorsing candidates.
Yeah, this might be an issue. Okay, so first let me say, I think it's a bad idea for the witness of the church to endorse candidates, right? That
Mm-hmm.
I think the church's mission is about forming souls, right? And
No.
ultimately about
My
saving
kingdom's
souls,
not
right?
of
And
this world.
so yeah, it's not something that I think churches should do, but I also think the Johnson Amendment is probably unconstitutional.
Mm-hmm.
A restriction of the right of free speech, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because free speech is not just for individuals, it's also for collections of individuals. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, I'm against the Johnson Amendment in legality,
Mm-hmm.
even if I also
Not in
don't think
practice.
churches
Yeah.
should. So yeah, I the Johnson Amendment could go, right, and I don't think that would be like I think that probably would be the right constitutional action.
But it may not be the but it but it but it but it won't be the right thing prophetically, in the sense of, like, for example, liberty is never wrong. So I don't want to be misconstrued. But you give a gun to a toddler and he's not going to know what to do with it. Know what I'm saying?
Well,
And
one of
so,
the other one
go
of the
ahead.
other problems, and this is probably the bigger problem with the Johnson Amendment, is it's not evenly enforced. Like the fact is, and again, I'm not saying this to.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a racial thing. Like no, it's got a racial aspect, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
a lot of these churches that generally can get away with whatever they want, a lot of the Black Protestant churches do
Mm-hmm.
a lot of politicking, and they have even before the
Yes.
Johnson Amendment went down, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of politicking from the pulpit, right? And that's the side of Christian nationalism that nobody ever wants to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Congress people coming and doing the Sunday service, or in our denomination doing the Sabbath service, right? And
Mm-hmm.
all these things, it's like that's very common. And you never hear, and there's not cases of the Johnson Amendment being enforced against that, right? Them losing their tax exempt status.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you have a law, right, that is not, or it's actually, I think the Johnson Amendment was a EO, wasn't it? Or I could be wrong there, but whatever. When
Mm-hmm.
you have a law, you have a statute that is not equally applied, well, then that in and of itself is not a good thing, right? We were supposed to have equal application of the
Mhm.
laws. So I would say the way it's currently been enforced is problematic. And then B, I just think government regulations of speech are never something that, like I said, here's another example. Right? I deplore communism. I think
Mhm.
communism is evil, and yet I would never advocate for people or groups losing their right to say communist crap. Right? Like they can say whatever they
Yeah.
want. Right? They can say untrue things. You have a right to say untrue things, and so I would just say
Mhm.
I see the Johnson Amendment as an undue. A, it's not equally enforced, and then B, it's a regulation on speech that makes me uncomfortable.
Another point they want to bring up is appoint judges with a proven record of religious liberty. With all of these, it's like who's appointing them, and would they be comfortable if it was all Muslim judges? And I'm not saying you can prohibit people, but when I guess maybe I'm looking at this from the prophetic standpoint of Revelation 13 and 14, um, that just let it be, right? Don't don't necessarily pick the best judges,
Yeah.
and the best
Well,
judges should understand that there should be religious liberty. But when you're looking for someone who's championing themselves, or perhaps they're marketing themselves as a religious liberty judge, who knows if it's not a sheep in wolf's clothing? Maybe I'm a little paranoid.
I would just say about like that point that you read.
Hmm.
The point is obviously true, right? We should
Yeah.
want to appoint justices
Hmm.
who have a good record of defending religious liberty. And listen, I think there are organizations, right? For instance, generally speaking, I think Federalist Society justices, right,
Hmm.
and those are generally, whatever. I think they actually do have a good record of, but again, that's like a proper understanding of religious liberty, right?
Hmm.
Now, I would not want justices that have Dan Patrick's
Yeah,
idea of
exactly.
defending
Hmm.
religious liberty, but no, I think, like I said, I actually think our current justices in the majority actually do have a good record here, right? Justice, I'll just one good example. I think Justice Gorsuch is an excellent judge when it comes to religious liberty. Clarence Thomas, right?
Hmm.
Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch were the two dissenters in a case involving Native American religious liberty rights on a piece of land and whatever, and they both were defending this Native American minority religions rights, right? In other words, so I think our court and the kind of the Reaganite, right, conservative movement that has kind of influenced the court for the last 40 years, I think they do get this issue right. So in that sense, I would agree with this point.
Hmm.
It's just I think Dan Patrick in this report are actually advocating for a different definition of what defending religious liberty looks like.
And that's the problem. And to be honest, I think where the danger to the general public is that a lot of people aren't versed in this stuff, and they just hear religious liberty and they want to promote it, and they don't understand that that you can quickly go the opposite end, right? You can go to the other extreme. And history shows, as you were reading the Fox Book of Martyrs, if you read the history of Europe and all its religious thing, that where one church or one religion gets a dominant position and the use of the sword, it never goes well. Never does. And
Mm.
that's what we, Gio and Joey, started the show about, and what Adventism worries so much about it, because we, as far as Christianity goes, we're a minority. And so the freedoms that get tend to be taken away are those of the minority groups. And so we are pretty loud in defending the rights of liberty of conscience for others. One thing I'm very proud about our denomination is that we've defended even to the Supreme Court level, Sunday keepers' right to worship on Sunday, even though we worship on the seventh-day Sabbath. And that is in keeping with the fact that freedom needs to be free for everybody and not just for those in positions of power or positions of authority.
Yeah, no, and just on that note, one thing that I think that is, I agree with you, that's something to be proud of our denomination for, but I think and this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, but we need to incorporate in other words, I think that there's a lot of people, right, including just ordinary, when I talk to ordinary conservatives and ordinary Republicans about Christian nationalism, now they may say, oh, well, that sounds kind of good, right? Because what they're thinking is, well, yeah, America had Judeo-Christian values, right? And I like that. But then when I actually explain to them, when I show them Joe Webben clips about, restricting the vote from certain people, or, that Jehovah's Witness shouldn't have the same rights, you know what most of those Republicans and conservatives say about that? They're like, that's nuts. I don't support that, right? I don't like that. And so I think as Adventists, if we incorporated our religious liberty stuff into our apologetics more, in other words, to me, right, Adventism, right, we're big on the character of God. So if we start hey, God is love, and then the next thing we say, right, and because of that, we will never, because God will never force you to see things like us, and then we go into our doctrines, right, because it warms people up. And this is something I was talking to a bro of mine about on actually July 4, and I was like, we missed a huge evangelistic opportunity as a church. July 4, America's 250th birthday, landed on a Sabbath. This would have been an excellent opportunity if we'd had some planning and stuff, from the top and stuff, beforehand, right? If every Adventist church in America
preach
on
a
that July
religious
4th
liberty,
had a religious liberty sermon, and then maybe some afternoon, a potluck, a good old fashioned Adventist, a haystack potluck. And we had done tons of inviting. Then we had panels where we had religious leaders and political leaders of various sides and parties having panel discussions on religious liberty issues in the afternoon. And then in the evening, we had some sort of musical program in our churches. And then after sundown, we went outside and we
and
had the
pop some
biggest
fireworks.
firework displays, right? But in other words, the way I would look at that is that would have been an opposite opportunity to say we're the this is something that I want to brand us as, we're the liberty people. We are, right. In other words, because when I look at American history and I look at the history of particularly of the American Revolution, it was preachers. It was the first Great Awakening happened in the colonies about 30 years before, and these were preachers preaching, right, obviously individual faith and all that, but they were preaching liberty. They were preaching this idea of resistance to tyranny, right, being obedience to God, right. These ideas, Baptist preachers, right, particularly, were preaching these ideas of liberty from the pulpit. And then those ideas of liberty transformed into the revolution, right, from the crown, right, from Parliament, right, and the formation of this government by liberty. And so it's as we see so many other Christians, right, and again, I don't think it's the majority, but as we see movements among other Christians against liberty, I think we could really win a lot of people to the truth by emphasizing, right, that we're the liberty people, right? We're the people who say, no, because of who God is, we will never force you to see things like us. I don't know. That's just something I've been
No,
thinking
that's
of
good.
since
That's
that.
good. Yeah, sometimes we tend to be late to the party. Nicholas Miller. We've had him on the show,
Yeah,
right?
we've had him.
Yeah, we had him
Yeah.
on the show. He wrote something about it, and he has some concerns, right? He had some good things that they liked. I want to read some of the concerns. He wrote this, or from his report, the summary: the wall was built by believers, not skeptics, and that's what you brought up earlier with Roger Williams, right? It was believed by, and secularists, they report paint separation, or the report, not secularists, the report that was written here points separation as an Enlightenment Jeffersonian idea inflated by modern secularists. But Roger Williams, Baptist pastor, founder of Rhode Island, which we spoke about, wrote in 1644 of and I'm quoting, a wall or hedge of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. Separation was a theological claim, not a secular claim. Right? And then he has this quote, the wall wasn't built to keep God out of America. It was built to keep Caesar out of the church. And that's a cool distinction, right? Because you and I would agree with the statement, or this statement I'm about to make, that we wish everybody in the United States would be a Seventh-day Adventist, including the president. But how do we wish that? By the outpouring of the Holy Spirit and by the persuasion of the power of Scripture, not by force, not by legislation. And that's what we should all hope for, that America, if you're a Christian, would be a Christian nation by the outpouring of a third great awakening, right? But the danger is some people want to do it by pen and paper and vote.
Well, and ultimately that transfers into by gun, right? Because, and this is a legitimate point, right? All like Romans 13 says, right, very clearly, right, the civil magistrate does not bear the sword in vain.
In vain,
right?
yeah.
And so that's the thing you have to understand about the civil power. Anything they do is done ultimately at the point of a gun, right? If you don't pay your taxes at a certain point, men with guns are going to show up, and like I said, that is right for them to do, right? They do have that right in their realm. But when you decide that your means of making Christians is of making people agree with your Christian sect or your religious sect is part of the job of government, what you're saying is that conversion can be done at the point of
a sword.
gun. But that can't be done, right? Because conversion is at the heart.
Another thing Miller brought up is that the report has a blind spot on religious nationalism. The report barely acknowledged the danger on the other side. From Constantine's empire to Europe's confessional states, church-state entanglement consistently produced coercion and dissenters, it goes on to say. The framers feared religious domination of the state at least as much as secular oppression of religion, which scarcely existed before the French Revolution. A report on religious liberty that only examines one direction of the threat, he goes on to say, is half a report. And that's true, right? If you're only focusing on what the secular people are doing and not the dangers of extreme Christian nationalism, then it's not a full report. I remember sitting in at Andrews University on a doctoral defense, and you usually have 3 professors from your own school and then a professor from a different school. And the professor, I remember, of the other school asked the candidate, do you even know how to formulate an argument? Because he was accusing the writer that all you were doing was cherry picking sources that agreed with you. What about, sharing sources that don't agree with you and dealing with them in the paper? And so it's the same thing that Miller is, chiding the report. You're only worried about secularism. But what about the rise of Christian nationalism? Which to me, it's a bigger danger. Why? Because as Christians and Seventh-day Adventists, we can easily spot secularism, right? But some people in Christianity don't see the creeping in of Christian nationalism, which is not good for them or for us as Adventists, right? And so that is, I think, a well-critiqued, having, we know Miller, he read the report and he had that critique of the report.
Yeah. Like I said, so I would say that certainly in the final crisis, right, we know that the final crisis will be done in the name of religion, right? So in that sense, it's more dangerous. But
and for real quick, let me just add this for the Christians, right? The Bible says this, right? There are gonna come a time where they kill you thinking they're doing service to God. So that's not secular people. They think they're honoring God while they kill you. And so that's to the point Joey was making. Go ahead.
Yeah, but I would say so. In knowing what the final crisis is, where we know that that is a danger we need to be worried about. But I would also point out that if you are, if you're it's 1950 and you're in Soviet Russia, right, and you're being oppressed, right, and your family's being killed by the atheist communists, right, like, yeah, the knowledge of what the final crisis is, right, like that's something we should still know, but you're just as persecuted, right? So in other words, so both dangers, right? And this goes,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll make a maybe we'll. I think we've talked about this before, but maybe we just actually need to do sometime a Daniel 11 episode.
Yeah, yeah.
But in Daniel 11, right, we have there's two powers that it kind of traces them through history, right? And as you go through history, who exactly is in the role, right? Sometimes it changes, but the powers relatively, you have two
The
powers kind
tension
of going through
remains
history.
throughout the whole chapter.
Yeah, and what it is, right? So you have one that it's in the name of God, right? So that's the king of the north, right? This
Mm-hmm.
is a persecuting power that does so in the name of God. And you have the king of the south, which is anti-God, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and so exactly how that plays out. And so both of these powers, these persecuting powers, they're both persecuting, they're both bad, and they should be resisted by God's people, and they will persecute God's people. So we want to be and this is where I would say, listen, if I had the opportunity to testify to the Religious Liberty Commission, I would have said, like, listen, there is two dangers, and
Mm-hmm.
and I think Nick is right here that they had a really good focus on the king, what I would call, right, in prophetic terms, the
Yeah.
king of the south danger, but they
Mm-hmm.
didn't focus enough on the king of the north danger. Where I would actually say that, and then I'll just do, I guess, a little inside baseball. In our particular denomination, I feel that a bigger, I don't want to say tendency because I don't think a majority of Adventists
Mm-hmm.
are necessarily doing this, but I would say the more compelling danger for Adventists sometimes has been to think that the King of the South will be our protector, or
Yeah.
that we'll, if we come over here and whatever. And so, if I was speaking to my Adventist brothers and sisters, I would say, it's like, no, right? God's people are not a part of the King of the North or the King of the South, and we must warn against both of these dangers.
And that's
Um,
why
but
Revelation 12:1 says, I mean, not Revelation, Daniel 12:1 says, Michael will stand up and protect his people, right? So you can't find refuge in the south or the north.
amen.
Mm. Look, another third point Miller brings up, and it's not just Miller, I forgot the other guy's name. Oh, Scriven is that not only, this is supposed to be a protection of religious liberty, yet it focuses mainly on Judeo-Christian. And it points out that Sikhs and Muslims are one of the most targeted hate crime groups per capita in the FBI, and they barely even get mentioned, right? So you're kind of, he goes on to say, you're undermining the fact that it's supposed to be religious liberty for all when you're really focusing on Judeo-Christian examples. And so that's one thing that if you really want to make this fully religious liberty, show, all the hate crime data for all people who are getting attacked. So that's another point they brought up.
Yeah, I actually do think that Jews are the number one,
Mm-hmm.
actually.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no, there's definitely hate crime stuff that happened, and again, I don't like this idea of a hate crime because
Yeah, yeah.
crimes
It's
done in the name
yeah,
of hate. But whatever,
yeah.
you
Mm-hmm.
that's another conversation. But
Mm-hmm.
no, like religious bigotry and acts of bigotry are there are stuff that's done against Muslims and Jews
Mm-hmm.
and like it happens to everybody. And to that point we should be against it. We should be against all of it. Um, so what? Since the Muslim example was brought up, one thing that I do think is important is that I think it is really important, particularly like, yes, that we have to address, right, when there's an act of terrorism or whatever, we have to address the problem of radical Islam. But I do think it is important that we also acknowledge that most of the ordinary Muslim citizens that you're going to come in contact with are not extremists, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the Muslims that you know, when you go to the store, right, and you see, and this is going to go to something that I think is a solution to how we live in a religiously pluralistic country, democracy, right? Is that I think so when we see, and this goes back to the Muslim example, when we see, a Muslim woman and she's got the burqa on at the store, Walmart or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
like if your kids are with you, like mention something to your kids about like, hey, like this is part of what makes America great is that
Mm-hmm.
none of us have to hide our religious identity in public, and practice like teaching your kids, and teaching, the young people around you that really that what like what America pioneered, and now the free world has kind of started to embrace this, but really this was an American invention of a society where Muslims and that a Muslim woman with a burqa and a Jewish man with a kippah and a Christian with a cross necklace, right? The idea that we can shop in the same shopping malls, the idea that we can drive the same streets and work at the same businesses, go to the same schools, the idea that that is even a thing, that's a modern, like that is really an American invention. And I would say Christians, right, the
Mm-hmm.
Christian founders of America, they helped shape that by establishing these ideas of equal citizenship and a wall of separation, but also free exercise, right? Like these things all came together. And like when I see people, again, when I see the left tearing down at the free exercise bit of it, or I
Mm-hmm.
see some people on the right tearing down at the free exercise, you don't
Or the
understand.
establishment, yeah, side of it.
Yeah, I would. Chesterton has this great thing where he says, "But if you're in the woods and you come upon a fence, before you can even think about tearing down the fence, you need to explain why the fence was put up in the first place. And if
Mm-hmm.
you can't do that, leave the fence where it is, right? And I think when it comes to right this idea of equal citizenship, that citizenship isn't based on your religious views or your race or these things, right? Like, so equal citizenship, the idea of a separation of church and state, the idea of free exercise for everyone, right? Like, these things are guardrails that were put up against very real problems that they were there to solve against. And so when people, yeah, like maybe sometimes you might get annoyed by the separation of church and state. That's a limit
Mm-hmm.
on this. But it's like, but first, before Mr. Patrick, right, before you decide to tear this down, well, can you explain to me the honest history of why the Establishment Clause is there?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think he's done his work. I'm not
Here's
convinced.
here's
Let's
some
just say that.
takeaways. Here's some takeaways that the summary and the Miller thing brought up, right? The report gets the diagnosis half right. Believers really do face cultural marginalization, but the cure of merging church and state has always been worse than the disease. I like that phrasing. Second, the wall of separation is not anti religious. It is a religious achievement won by persecuted believers like Roger Williams, and Adventists are its heirs and guardians of that, right? Because we know that it actually provides ultimate freedom when we keep that separation. Three, both clauses together are the safeguard. Free exercise protects your right to worship. Establishment keeps anyone from using the government to make you worship their way. And so the report is weak on the establishment while trying to puff up the free exercise up, right? And you need it, you need both. And then fourth, it says our history, and this is coming from an Adventist perspective. Sunday law prosecution, A.T. Jones, Liberty Magazine, isn't nostalgia. It's the lens. What happened to Sabbath-keepers under majority-backed religious legislation once can happen again if we let down our guard. And finally, pastoral landing. This is a call to principle engagement, not fear. This is why your idea of if we would have took advantage of 4th of July 250 would have been great. Proactive instead of reactive. Prayer for leaders. Defend liberty for all religious as vigorously as for Christians and keep Christ's line bright. Caesar's things to Caesar, God things to God. And that line is biblical. Render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and render to God what belongs to God.
That's actually the actual origins of the separation of church and state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right there.
Christ himself established the separation.
Mm-hmm. So, any closing thoughts as we wrap up here? We've gone 50 minutes, and I got to wake up mad early.
Yeah, and I would just say that I am like I always tell people, right? Sometimes people, feel like, we have to hedge our patriotism, right? Do we have to hedge it? No, I am a 3 cheers for America person, right?
Yeah.
I am, like I like to say, that meme of the guy with shirtless with a red, white, and blue shorts on. He's got a mullet. He's holding an American flag in a rainstorm in the middle of the road. Like,
and a
that's me.
straw in his mouth.
Yeah, exactly. That's me. Like, I'm a 3 cheers for America person, right? And I think, but that doesn't mean, right, that I think America's ever been perfect. It's never been perfect. But the ideas of our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, right, the Federalist Papers, right, like our system of government, this is the best that sinful human beings have ever done, right? And so what I would say, right, as we see, this Religious Liberty Commission kind of undermining, I said, no, Americans, stand tall and be proud of your heritage, right? That your Christian forebears gave to you, but the genius of what your Christian forebears did is that they created a system, and I'll go even further, right? It was they were basically Anglo-Christian forebears, right? So these were English colonists, right? These were Protestant Christians, but the genius of what they did is they created a system that when it's honored, anybody, right? Anybody can be equal, right? Obviously, as it was extended, right? So that eventually, right, the franchise and the fullest promise of the Declaration was eventually, it had to grow to include our African American brothers and sisters, right? But it did grow, and we didn't get rid of the system. We just allowed it to include more people, and then to my Catholic friends or Catholic viewers who may view this, when you guys first came over here as immigrants, right? The system, even though the system, on paper, right, we had religious liberty for everybody, but you were treated as an outsider, right? There were lynchings of Catholic immigrants, right? Because Catholics were viewed as foreigners and bad. And so, well, that was also wrong. But we didn't, in order to stop that, we didn't get rid of our system. No. We lived into our values more. And so eventually, right, Catholics were then included, right? And so Jews have actually been included from the beginning because Washington, right, there was some bigotry or whatever, because in Europe, Jews had been viewed with suspicion. They'd never been treated. There had never been a nation since the fall of Israel where Jews had been equal citizens with non-Jews until the United States of America, right? And so we just have a glorious heritage, right? And we shouldn't allow anyone to the right or to the left to undermine that heritage.
Yep. And I want to end here. Ready? It's a famous quote. We've used it before. When a religion is good, I conceive it will support itself. And when it does not support itself, and God does not take care to support it so that its professors are obliged to call for help of the civil power, 'tis a sign I apprehend of its being a bad one. My hope is not in the secular government. My hope is in Jesus Christ. And if my God cannot protect me, or if my God chooses to let me die a martyr, but I'm doing it his way, then I can rest assured that I will be in the ultimate government on the ultimate day for the ultimate eternity in heaven. Until then, the promise of this show and the promise of Gio and Joey individually is that we will fight for your right to live free, to follow the dictates of your own conscience. And we pray that if you're not a Christian, or particularly if you're not a Seventh-day Adventist, that the power of God's love, the power of the Holy Spirit, and the power of the biblical arguments that are made by us or by the Word of God itself will bring you into a deeper connection with Jesus Christ. Until next time on the Gio and Joey Show, be blessed.